We're good. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the panel, A Close Reading of the Six Most Common Transformative Agreements. My name is Chuck Hemenway, Copyright Clearance Center. I'll be joined today by Dr. Heather Staines from Delta Think and Jamie Carmichael from CCC to talk about the realities, both at a macro level and on the ground regarding transformative agreements. For those of you in the library space, we realize that things have changed a bit, and that transformative agreements bring a new set of tasks to be done and puzzles to be solved in the way, especially in data and analytics, to make sure that you can have meaningful interactions with your partners and get and give good value on both sides in the market. So in this session, we're going to hear from Heather about what's going on at a top level, the trends in the market over the last few years and where that's taking us. And we're going to hear from Jamie about what the most common agreements in place in the market, what those look like, and the kind of workflows that users are subject to under those agreements. And then we're going to make this more of a conversation than a lecture. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So we'd love to hear your experiences in your for your faculty and in your campuses and your settings. So please feel encouraged to contribute and say what's on your mind. So with that, we're going to start with Dr. Staines to take us through some slides regarding Delta Think data.
Hi, good morning. I hope everyone who made it to the aquarium last night had an enjoyable time. I'm really excited to be here today. Was pleased when Chris Canale and Chuck reached out for the session. I'm Heather Staines. I'm working currently as a senior consultant at Delta Think, and I also work on something that's called the Open Access Data and Analytics tool. So a lot of the results that I'll be showing you today are available through that tool, and I'm happy to talk to you more about that. Juggling a lot of papers up here, so hopefully a big wind won't come in and blow them away. Okay. So every year, Delta Think undertakes what we call our annual market sizing survey. That takes place over the summer. We compile the results, and our data analyst over in the UK, Dan Pollock, works around the top level findings. So these are some headlines from that exercise. You can read more about it online. From the analysis that we did, we found that around 36% of the scholarly articles published in paid for open access, so that's the gold and the hybrid, in 2020. And that accounts for 9% of the total market value. And the market value then is either the revenue generated by the content producers or the costs incurred by the content consumers. And again, these are just some headlines. We can come back in the question. So when we looked at the overall market in 2020, we saw 975 million, and that's a large increase over 2019. Larger than we had expected. It does show that the OA journals market is growing more quickly than the overall journals market, and larger than had been anticipated prior. So OA now drives approximately half of growth in the journals market, and for 2021, we're estimating 1.1 billion for that revenue. So now that OA is growing faster than the overall market, we do see OA cannibalizing articles that would have otherwise ended up in subscription publications. So that subscription output could start shrinking as soon as 2023. And the revenue from subscription should, according to our analysis, start slowing in 2023, which is an interesting to look at. An estimated 50% of output in open access in 2024, which is, as many of you know who watch the Plan S requirements, when the required funding for Plan S is currently slotted to end. We anticipate that revenue is going to take quite some additional time to make it to that 50% mark, probably by current estimates around 2039, but that obviously is subject to change as the data continues to come in. Every month we publish a free newsletter called News and Views. And back in the spring, we did 3 issues on transformative agreements and transformative journals. So much of what I'll be talking about now comes from that spring publication. You can sign up for these online. They do pull data and analysis from our open access data and analytics tool. So when we looked at transformative journals and these numbers, we ran this back in the spring, and we will be repeating it as we go forward. We looked at the measures of compliance for the different criteria that Plan S has indicated. And we looked at how the growth in those journals designated as transformative journals is growing in comparison to historical growth of hybrid journals. So the Coalition S folks were very helpful. They provided us with a calculator, which I'll show you, which allows us to create a model that looks at the average market values for, and again, we pull that information from our tool. We cross-referenced the journals at the time, 2,266, on the Coalition S website that were designated by their publishers as transformative journals. And we looked at that together with our historical data on the uptake and meeting those targets. So let me take you through some of the findings. So first, just a quick note on definitions. Your familiarity level with what's called a transformative journal might vary. So a transformative journal can continue to have a subscription component, but it must, and this is for funding, it must demonstrate increasing OA uptake of at least 5% in absolute terms and at least 15% in relative terms year on year, and that can be assessed across a 3-year period. And when it reaches the magic mark of 75% OA, it's supposed to flip and become entirely open access. We wanted to get a clarification around these terms. So again, the folks at Plan S were really helpful and giving us these definitions. So absolute looks at the proportion of the journal output, and I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. And relative looks at the number of articles and the increase that should happen year upon year. So the graphic is a little bit fuzzy, I apologize, but this is an example of a journal that publishes about 1,600 articles a year. So it maintains a steady article output, and it looks at the growth that is starting. Here I'm going to go to my cheat sheet for a second. It's starting at a low rate, so it's really down in the single digits for its OA output. So if you look at around 8%, so that's where the orange line and the dotted gray line start to diverge. Around 8%, or 128 papers in that year, output in year 1. For a while, the absolute growth criteria will drive that target growth. And when it reaches around 40% or 640 articles out of its 1,600, then the relative criteria becomes the more challenging. So this really holds regardless of where you're starting in terms of your percentage of OA and your article output. 40% is around the point when things start to flip or start to switch from one criteria to another. So by year 12, according to this estimate, so forget for a second that 2024 end date, it's going to take this particular journal until year 12 to get to that 75% mark for OA, where it would do its flip. Now, if we look at a different example, if a journal is starting at a lower percent of OA, let's say 5%, when it gets to that same starting point, the absolute targets will remain driver for longer. And the point of flipping, gets to be 1 year later. So these little calculators that you can use. If you're starting with a higher percentage of OA or you've been doing it for longer, you can adjust the graph to kind of demonstrate your model. So let's look at historical OA uptake versus the transformative journal requirements. And so we looked at the content material that we had in our OA database. And again, from that 2,266 transformative journals. And those were across 12 different publishers who had by the spring designated that, cross-referencing with our own data to look at how the journal's performance over the past few years compared with those requirements and put it into context. So historically, the OA proportion of journal output has not grown as quickly as the Plan S requirements would require. When we looked at the last 3 years, the total number of papers published across all journals currently marked as transformative journals, they were only growing at about half the rate they would need for them to continue to meet that Plan S seal of approval. And so the number of journals that met the requirements were very, very small. Only about a dozen out of that 2,000 had actually done so for the past 3 years. 2/3 of them, however, had met targets for at least 1 year. And that's where the rolling 3-year criteria, becomes important, because you can adjust for sort of fits and starts and maybe outside impact, that might be affecting those numbers. So you don't need to meet them every single year. So the data showed about 20 journals had met that 75% OA uptake mark. And 2/3 of the journals, 68% actually, had 20% or less. So relatively smaller number. Smaller journals had the fastest growth. Many of those smaller journals are newer, so they're starting from a lower number initially. If we just segment the findings for the larger journals, they seem to be actually static over the past 3 years. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So how has the historical journal uptake, been in meeting these transformative journal titles? So one big caveat, which I can't emphasize enough, is we're looking at historical data. Transformative journals have only been around for a little bit of time. And so we do expect large outreach campaigns, both from the university side, letting researchers know that there are transformative agreements in place, as well as from the publisher side, letting authors know that they can publish in particular journals or with particular publishers. So we would expect when we go to next year's analysis that this changes, because those outreach campaigns have either just started or they're not kicking off yet. But this is what we found when we looked at the historical data. Just over a third met neither target, neither the absolute nor the relative. Another third met the relative, but not the absolute. A tiny pie there for going around clockwise met the absolute, but not the relative. And then a third, actually looking at the historical data, would be characterized as meeting both. Again, this is just looking at their output and how that shifted. This is prior to the designation of transformative journals. So a couple more caveats, and we can go back and revisit some of these questions, because it's a lot to throw at you. And I would direct you to the news and views, which over 3 issues lays things out in a lot more detail with more helpful graphs. When we looked at those journals designated as transformative journals, the ESAC website where those are listed, they don't include ISBN, so we had to go through an ISBN matching exercise, and we were able to get about 95 of them. So, and certainly all of the larger ones. Bears repeating, historical performance is not necessarily a guide to what will happen in the future. We do expect that to change, and we're watching it closely. The fact that you can use that 3-year rolling average will be critical. The effects of COVID, are certainly to be figured in there. the numbers for 2020 and the numbers for 2021, all of our publishers are indicating, increased output. So we do expect that there may be a dip as people work through their backlogs. The targets presented by Plan S are aggressive, but not impossible to meet. For those larger publishers that have been working in the space longer, overcoming that sort of static state, where they've been sitting, that's going to be a challenge. And then what will happen at the end of 2024? Will it be extended? What will happen then? I'd like to point out that it's not without risk for a publisher to designate their journal as a transformative journal. You might think, well, go ahead, say it's a transformative journal, you can get your Plan S money. But from a publisher standpoint, particularly smaller society publishers, once they've designated that transformative status, it changes the conversation that they have with their libraries and with their subscribers. So if there's a notion that some publishers who might be expected to move into that space are holding back, it's because they're trying to be very careful around timing. Anyway, I've got, there's a link on the slide here that will take you to the news and views. We also did some webinars that are recorded online if you want to go into more detail, and you can always contact me for further information. Thank you. Oh, I should have gone to that.
Okay, Jamie, I can't see you, so I'm just gonna listen for your cue to move the slides, okay?
I'm ready and I'll let you know. Thank you, Chuck. So yeah, Chuck and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our view from the middle as an intermediary. So next slide, please. Maybe the best way to get started is to set a little context for those of you who are thinking, CCC, aren't these the rights licensing people? Well, yes, and we also foster collaboration among stakeholders in the open scholarly publishing community. A big part of our mission is to bring people together to explore common challenges and implement mutual solutions. And today is really no different. We're hoping to raise some concepts between what Heather shared and what I'm about to show that can lead into what we hope is a pretty interactive discussion. So we also provide technology in this space. CCC uses a community-based approach to create open access workflows through a platform called RightsLink for Scientific Communications that serves all stakeholders across the ecosystem. So institutions, consortia, funders, individual authors, and publishers. And we're really committed to creating tools within a shared infrastructure to facilitate efficient and effective publishing of open access content. And lastly, as a partner for stability and stewardship, we know we're in a tremendous time of change for the scholarly publishing community. We've been an active partner in the evolution of hybrid and pure OA publishing models, working with publishers and their stakeholders to put the author and the institutional experience first. I seem to have lost the slides, but I have a beautiful view of Chuck. Could we get those back up? Thank you. This is excellent. Growing community. So yeah, there's a growing community that depends on us to evolve this infrastructure in a scalable and sustainable way. You can see some of the numbers there in a relatively short amount of time. RightsLink's agreement tools at the most basic level are used by publishers to set up all types of publishing arrangements. So pure OA deals, membership discounts, read and publish, anything in between. Which then helps the institution streamline funding requests, payment, and reporting across multiple publisher deals. So the core purpose here is really to streamline operations and drive down costs related to the management of OA agreements. Next slide, please. So there are 6 common types of deals that we see through the system, and we think it's important to show these prevalent types of arrangements for publishers and institutions to assess whether these will work for them versus coming up with something more custom and potentially more complex. I think it's really important to note that deviations in the way deals are implemented and the workflows needed to support them can add cost and complication to the process. So we really urge stakeholders to consider that as they experiment with their emerging models. So let's take these one by one. The first type of agreement that we see enables faculty from eligible institutions to publish an unlimited number of articles during the life of the agreement. The second type enables faculty from eligible institutions to publish articles up to an agreed upon cap or max number of articles during the life of the agreement. So that's where the agreement is about volume as a cap, versus the next one, number 3 on the list, where agreements can enable faculty from eligible institutions to publish articles up to an agreed spending threshold during the life of the agreement. So value versus volume in the previous example. The next type of agreement enables faculty from membership institutions to receive a prearranged institutional discount during the life of the agreement. And the next is a consortium model where faculty from eligible member institutions can publish articles up to an agreed upon spending threshold, either using a first come, first served shared bank or a budget allocated to each member institution. So we're seeing a little bit of variability across consortium models. And the last one here, number 6, this type of arrangement enables faculty to have the institution pay a predetermined amount, and then the faculty member pays the remaining balance. So this is called the multi-payer workflow. That's a phrase coined by California Digital Library, and that's the 6th type of agreement. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So 3 common workflows. The first here is standard market-driven flows. And we want to know from the discussion toward the end is this what you're using? Is this what you're seeing? Is there an emerging flow you might want to see from your suppliers? The first one over on the left here is that not all authors are funded. So the first scenario is when an author transacts directly using a standard e-commerce flow. So publishers send RightsLink the metadata to let us know that an article has been accepted, and then the author gets a notification to come in and pay an APC charge. But for agreements, which are the second and third flows here, these deals can be supported by 2 primary workflows. And so the first is author seeking funding, and the second is an unmediated or completely touch-free workflow, which means there's no author involvement, and optionally institutions can choose to auto-approve requests, but that decision is really up to the institution. Next slide, please. So keys to success. We can say that many things are key to success, like communication and transparency and trust. But at a very practical level, it takes metadata embedded in workflows to advance OA publication models. And I would like to leave you with some questions to ponder as you assess your end-to-end workflows. And the reason for this is that from our vantage point, we can see that there are a couple weak links in the system related to metadata. And the first is that accurate affiliation information is inconsistent and incomplete. But what we do see are some glimmers of hope where publishers who require authors to complete or validate affiliation information and then guide them with either training materials or messaging in their submission workflows are most successful in achieving the highest rates of reliable affiliation information. The other weak link is accurate funding information. And so for publishers, we ask that you use every opportunity in your submission workflows to message why accurate and complete funding and grant information is important. Ideally, there's better system integration so the author has less to do, less to think about. But until then, this route is really highly recommended. And you can make that messaging about wins and benefits for the authors. And for institutions, how are you communicating the deals to your authors? And do you have channels to help emphasize the importance of asserting the data? How are you assisting them? And for funders, just some food for thought. Are you working with publishers or other intermediaries to connect grant IDs to publication? So these were just some of the questions we wanted to raise here. I think we can transition now into some questions or comments from the crowd, Chuck.
Thanks. And I'll just take a second to let the folks on Pathable know that we've seen the messages that you're having trouble with the slides, and we're going to do what we can to upload those. There's a poor fellow working feverishly over here to try to figure it out. So rest assured, we've heard you. So yeah, at this point, I think it would be smart to open up the floor to any questions that folks want to ask either of our presenters. And short of that, I have a few I can seed the clouds with, but would like to open it up to the floor for questions.
Review that for the recording for the folks online.
Okay. Okay. So your question is, what solutions do we imagine are out there for solving the metadata problems? Okay. I can lead that off, I think, because I'm very close to the implementation of some of these solutions. Most of it boils down to iron-fisted rigor and discipline. Explaining to faculty that they're not welcome to use Gmail email addresses in certain processes unless it's absolutely necessary. Creating an expectation that when they do submit, they're carrying in things like grant identifiers and things that really impact the analysis downstream. And two, I would say, there are all sorts of stakeholders in the market that are working with your faculty and working with authors and really don't want to overburden them, but everybody now really understands the value of the data. So the time has come to raise the bar in terms of forcing data at the right stages of publication, so that all the stakeholders can get what they need, understand the impact of research and where the dollars go in the market, and are things being published in a compliant manner. So it's really all about a very strong submission process and a clearly communicated expectation. And that I think probably plays into one of the questions that we all talked about prior to this, was communication within the institution. It's a bit of a blind spot to us. We're looking at the market from the publisher end, honestly, the wrong end of the horse. So it's hard for us to understand, what kind of energy goes in on campus and inside an org to communicate to faculty what is best practice, what is the expectation. And we're curious if that's an area where, innovation is needed. So hard to do a show of hands with a virtual audience, but anybody in the room feel like they're doing a really great job communicating expectations to faculty? Seeing 0 hands right now. Okay. So maybe our suspicions are right, that this is a place where there could be more collaboration market-wide, publishers, institutions, funders, everybody kind of getting in to help the faculty along to better recognize the value of good data and the value of just owning those responsibilities.
Could I jump in on that?
Please do.
Is this on? Great. Yeah, I can't emphasize enough the importance of the data. I think the number one question that we get from our library partners is around actual APCs that are paid. And we do have, we collect that data from publishers around their listed APCs. And we have an algorithm that we apply, which kind of tries to take it down into an area that we think is closer in terms of estimate. But collecting what's actually paid, can be a challenge that might not be immediately apparent when you're going through the submission system process. In some cases, publishers enable, additional charges to come through the same flow as APCs, and they're not actually APCs, and kind of sorting out those different line items is going to be a work in progress. I think the number one question that I'm hearing from the publisher side is around the waiver process, and most publishers have fairly robust waiver processes, but no two actually track their waivers in the same way, at least that I've found. For example, there may be invited content like editorials, or for some types of journals, a higher percentage of content, like a review article, might be invited, and that doesn't carry an APC, but it's in the system as a 0 APC, which can't be tracked separately from a waiver. So I think there's room for industry discussions and best practices around, what could be done that will, at the outset and sort of midway through the process, help us to kind of track back some of these things. And if any of you would like to do, a little project, we'd be happy to chat. Just bringing a kind of a more informed sense of process, I think is going to help us sort it out more in the coming years.
Jamie, I'm wondering, are you seeing any questions coming in through the Zoom channel?
No, mostly comments about the AV problems.
Mostly comments of delight in seeing my face on camera versus the slides, I'm sure. All right, then let me drop one in and see if it sparks any communication. We have a question in the room. Please go.
Like, sorry, I'm at a very small school and we only publish so many papers a year. Like, could I just instead of paying a subscription, could I just pay for the papers we're going to publish? Is that kind of like crazy? We don't use all the journals. We have years and years of counter report. We have about 8 years of counter reports, and we know what journals we use and don't use. And we know which journals we publish in. And I want to be able to help our early career researchers, and I want to be able to pay the library. Instead of paying for subscriptions, I want to pay for them to do open access instead of subscriptions. So I want to get out of the subscription business and get into the OA business. I want to not be stuck with paying subscriptions anymore. I want to leave that model. I don't want to talk about subscriptions anymore. And I don't know how to have that conversation. I'm actually even scared to say it in a room of librarians and publishers, but I'm just going to throw that out there because I want to change the narrative a little bit, and I don't know how to do that.
Well, I think I'll take a first pass at that. You're asking the right questions. So what you're outlining are some of the major deals that are happening in the market, where folks are kind of converting those subscription dollars into publishing dollars, for lack of a better explanation, and moving, through mandate and other mechanisms to convert outputs to open. So I wouldn't be. There's no question too small, really, to talk to your publishers about. Some may be able to help you immediately, and some, may not, based on volumes. But I think it's probably a very common conversation that's happening right now with your subscription agents and your publisher contacts. So get in touch with them and just ask them straight out, how do we migrate this model to something that's different? And it won't be a foreign question to them. They're getting it daily. So they should be able to tell you what their process will be to offer you a different kind of business model. But yeah, it's happening large and small.
We have a question from Pathable, and I also just wanted to let folks know that we will absolutely post the slides in the files section as soon as we can, and all of our contact information is in there if you have any questions about what we covered live. So the question is from Lisa Hinchliff, and she's asking, I think this might be a question for Heather, are you including pure publish and subscribe to open agreements in your definition of transformative agreements?
So the transformative agreement criteria that we used for the analysis I just presented was the Plan S criteria. So it's limited to the Plan S related national consortia agreements across the Plan S countries. And I don't believe that it includes subscribe to open, likely because those agreements were very, very new at the time when the analysis started. I will say when we do our revenue forecast, we're only including the gold and the hybrid APCs because we could consider it to be the monetizable portion of the market. So things that are in the bronze category, which are free to read but don't carry a license that makes them free to reuse, and content that's posted or publishers that are allowed a green, that is not, there's not a revenue generating element of that or a cost towards the consumer side. So those are excluded, just the gold and the hybrid. But for this analysis, this was the Plan S criteria. So it was a limited subset.
Had a question come in through Pathable, and I think, Heather, this might also be for you. Question from Deirdre. When the subscription model decreases in 2023, what happens to small libraries that do not need to support researchers with APC funding or support?
I think it ties onto Liz's question. I think small libraries and small publishers, this whole process is going to be a challenge. I don't think that number, even if negotiation around transformative agreement was the path that everyone wanted, there's not enough time in the day for every library to meet with every publisher. So it's going to be, I mean, there are a lot of really tough questions that are going to happen. You know, some questions around smaller libraries. It's also very discipline specific. And I know that Liz, you guys think about this, and a lot of the content that you're talking about is in the medical field, but I'm a historian by training. My husband's an English professor. You know, I talk about this a lot, but I think it just bears repeating. By discipline, OA uptake and potential for OA uptake may have ceilings in certain areas. And not just, you know, in the humanities, you know, certain types of engineering, there's maybe a maximum, you know, percentage point that the publishers think that they might meet. Recently in the summer, AAAS did some analysis and they announced that they were sticking with the subscription model because that's what they saw their authors focusing on most closely. And so you know the most about your researchers. And again, it goes back to data. It's not just where they publish, but what disciplines they're publishing in. You know, it's a complex situation, and whether you consider yourself a read organization only or a publish organization, I know that there are models that take that, you know, into consideration. But I think there's going to be a lot of conversations in Charleston conferences to come about, you know, what the path forward looks like, and not just to 2024 because that's coming up, you know, at light speed, but you know what happens in that next few years afterwards.
Thank you, Jamie. Any other Zoom questions that you want to pop in?
Yep. So that previous question about pure OA agreements, yes, we support in RightsLink any kind of open access arrangement, whether it's transformative or pure OA. And PLOS's Community Action Publishing Program is an example of that. And then I think, Heather, we're looking for a little more clarification around relative versus absolute definitions as well.
So yeah, I realized that it was a kind of a rush through. So just again on the definitions. So absolute is you start with the proportion of the journal's output that's OA, and then every year it has to increase by 5%. So if you're starting at 25% OA this year, next year you're going to have to be 30%. The year after you're going to be 35%. But you're also trying to meet the relative growth criteria, which is the number of OA articles in the journal must also increase by 15%. So not just proportionally, but by the number. If a journal publishes 100 OA papers this year, it must publish 115 next year, 132 the following year. And I think one of the things to bear in mind is you can start accepting articles to be published with an OA license, but you might not be able to increase your number of submissions sufficiently to add, that number. It's easy to maybe switch the license something's publishing under, but growing the number of underlying submissions so that you can get that that number of publications up, that's challenging. And that's why at a certain point, one of the criteria, becomes harder to meet than the other, let alone meeting both of them, at the same time. So.
You have another question. It's the third rail question that Kristen Cederstrom's put out there. Is the unbundling of big deal packages is it an attempt to create a new big deal with libraries?
I'm not a publisher. Any
You're not a
publishers
publisher.
care to?
Okay. Yeah, I think we'll let that one sleep, Kristen. None of us really could speak for publishers, but I think, obviously most are trying to find a even revenue replacements. They hope not to have their revenues erode by transformation. I can tell you that much. Robert also had a question about subscription agents. Is there anybody in the space exploring managing new mechanisms for OA as the subscription model, erodes? Looking to players like OA Switchboard and others. And I would answer that by saying, Robert, it's something we're discussing. Do there need to be other mechanisms that make it simpler for smaller institutions who don't have the negotiating teams to go out and do, all of these kinds of discussion. So I think you'll see that. I think you'll see things happen in the space that should maybe bring some form of collective solution into the market, but that's a ways off. I think it'll be a year, 2 years before anything interesting happens.
I agree, Chuck. I think we'll likely see a blend of existing and new in terms of collaboration and system integration to help drive efficiencies and drive those costs out of the process, right? Let's simplify this so that as an industry we can advance.
Sir, could we ask you to go to the mic? Yeah, we've got a question in the room.
Hi, my name is Josh. I'm with ACM, publisher ACM. So we look at corresponding author affiliation as the way we do that sort of one-to-one match when we're looking at publication output for a given institution. My question is, have you figured out any ways to leverage the additional affiliated authors on a given article? For us, typically there's about 5 authors per article. So we use the corresponding author, but then we have all this additional affiliation information that is by and large anecdotal for us because we can't really leverage it. And it would be useful to us to be able to do so in terms of like looking at possible cost sharing amongst institutions. I was wondering if you'd had any progress in that.
We have, and again, it goes back to the nucleus of this whole thing, which is data. We're managing agreements now which look past author 1 to other authors in the pile to map them to resources and to map their affiliations. So if there's rigor in the capture, right? If the manuscripts are forced to collect that data on authors 2 through X or some subset of that, right? Then it becomes possible to really do anything from a technology level, from a technology perspective. And we're managing deals right now which do, like Max Planck and others are saying, if any one of these authors on the paper needs support, we'll support them. But the data's got to be there, right, to pull that match together. But that's a reality. Those deals are out there right now. I think we're right up against time. Do we have one last question? Anybody in the room? Anybody on Pathable? How about Zoom? Actually, Anne followed up your question about, is the corresponding author a reliable way to identify which institution paid the APC? I think probably, Anne, the answer is no, right? Corresponding author may or may not actually match up with who pays the APC. Today, we see in our systems, probably 40–50% of the users doing payment, not the author. They're other actors. And it is not a guarantee that the funding will line up with the corresponding author. All right, that puts us right at time. Thanks everybody for your patience with the slides. We promise you'll get them And we're definitely available for anybody that didn't get their question answered. We'll do what we can to support you after. Around for our presenters, thanks very much. Dr. Staines, Jamie Carmichael. Great afternoon.
Bye, thank you.